I mean,
Found tricky.
sorry, I just did the record thing because I keep forgetting to start that when I start the lesson. Yeah, so yeah, it goes back to what we were saying about the pentatonic scale and certain extensions, right? If you take a minor chord and you add a 7, you soften the chord and you make it sound more like a major chord.
Yeah.
And that's because it shares more in common with its tonic, its relative major, right? Like we can see that here, like B minor and D are relative major, relative minor. So if we take B minor and we take the root down to the 7, well, that looks a lot like a D.
Yeah.
You know, it's the same internals, right? Similarly, right, if we take the major version, D, and we make it a 6, right? We take the 5 and move up a tone, right?
Yeah.
Now we're back at something that looks like B minor, except in this instance, I'm thinking of it as D6.
Yeah.
So yeah, the similarities between them are many, and you'll find they're actually the further and further you dig, the less you're going to want to care so much about those primary colors. Like one of the exercises I've been working on at the moment is using what's called a triad pair. So you choose 2 chords in the key that represent chord tones and extensions, and play them as triads. So like one of the examples, right, is this. They're not multiple chord changes. They're all different voicings of like E major 13.
Yeah.
Next week. And one of the reasons for doing that, now it's a complicated sound that. One of the reasons for doing that is you have a small group and you're trying to fill space. You might want melodic movement inside of your chords. So instead of having something that's, you know, I've got some options now. And it's still all that E major 13 kind of sound, especially as the rest of the band will kick in and root it on E.
Yeah.
And the melody will really sit on E, right? No, that kind of stuff is not always going to be appropriate in the same way that, you know, it's not always going to be appropriate to change every major chord you got to a major 7. You know, it will work definitely better in some songs than in others. And in some circumstances than others. Sometimes just a plain major or a plain minor chord is the right thing to do. But there are a lot of instances where adding these tensions, or what we might call upper structure triads. So that means that if you take, say, a C chord, and you think about the first 3 extensions going up in thirds, so you get B, D, and F. C,
Yeah.
E, G, B, D, F, right? Well, you could see that as a C11, C major 11, or you could go B, D, F, B, D, F, B, D, F. All right, so that's a B diminished or a B minor 7 flat 5, right? So I could think about that chord as C major plus B minor 7 flat 5.
Yeah.
And that means I could play those 2 chords over that thing. Or if someone was C rooting me, sounds a bit dangerous, then I could play, right, because that bottom section is a B minor 7 flat 5. Rooting that on C, now I'm getting that kind of C major 11 sound.
Yeah.
And the coolest tool about that, other than expanding your harmonic knowledge, is that it becomes really easy to find any chord you want to at any time. You know, you look at the arrangement of notes and you're like, oh, it's an E minor and this put together. It's 2 simple things that I already know put together. So all I need to do is do fingerings that combine these 2. And in thinking in that way, you can come up with a lot of interesting stuff. You know, like you think that A dominant 11 is an A and a G chord put together. So as long as I have an A, right, some components of G, so that's from this G chord. Here's a C sharp from A. There we go. Now here's an A dominant 11 sound, right? Another one, the Stevie Wonder kind of one, right? Here's an A root note. And I know that dominant 11 is A and G, so if I put G on top of this A root note, He's a great dominant. I love this shape. Right? So in many ways, that's much easier than the way the guitarists usually learn, which is I've got to learn a shape for everything.
Yeah.
You know, like, oh man, I'm stuck. I don't know what a -6 sharp 13 shape is.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to sort of break out of, trying to think more like, because I took up piano for like a year and a half, and I've sort of stopped now. I want to focus more on guitar, but that because my reading has always been pretty good, and like transferring that to the piano was easy, and I noticed that it's a lot easier to play chords on the piano because everything's just laid out, whereas on guitar I was still thinking of everything as a shape, not as sort of it's this sort of combination of notes. I was just thinking that shape, or it's because it's not sort of this combination of notes in this specific order. And I think that's the thing I want to sort of try to break out of more.
Yeah, well, I mean, the closer you look at these triads, the more that's going to happen. I can't. I mean, you know, it's funny how like. Sorry, I was just enabling a different feature. It's funny how I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but like you suddenly stumble onto some new breakthrough for your playing, some new concept. You're like, wow, like I must be the first person ever to use this idea because I've never heard it talked about. And then you go to YouTube and you're like, suddenly all the videos in my feed. So interesting. Now that I've been teaching this course on triads, I've been getting fed a lot of videos on triads, and one of the ones that came out very recently, I think last week, was one from Tim Pierce. I don't know if you know Tim Pierce. He's a session legend. He's especially through the 80s and 90s. He was like one of those guys that's just kind of on everything. And just a really solid parts player. And he's got his own channel where he talks to the YouTube audience, etc. One of his latest videos was the guitar habit that changed my life. Lo and behold, it's triads.
Yeah.
And thinking about it less about the shape thing. I think the shape thing is like, well, it reminds me a bit of I think my great grandfather's piano stick. Couldn't play piano, but through figuring out like how this might work, he created a stick with all these dowels sticking out of it that he could roll over and touch to the keyboard, play piano with, right? And it's kind of like auto harp for the piano. Yeah, he needed to know where to route the stick in places, but that's a lot easier than having to understand how all these notes connect.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I feel like learning guitar by shapes is like that. It's like a quick answer to I could find my way around the neck. I'm sure you might have done the same thing. Like I learned an E chord, right? And give it a couple of months or whatever. My dad was like, okay, well, if you move every note in that chord up one fret, it goes up one step chromatically. So you go, okay, well, so this is an F chord, right?
Yeah.
F sharp, G, and it's a very simple idea. Oh, everywhere I move, this is going to be major. I have no idea which one's the fifth. I have no idea which one's the third.
Yeah.
I know nothing about this other than this shape unlocks something for me. And annoyingly, for the vast majority of music written for the guitar in the past 80 years, that's enough. You can really get through it that way because that's a lot of how people were understanding it. It's a bit like, I don't know if you've ever done a lot of theory analysis, and when they get to rock music, there's a whole section of theory analysis which is, are they the open chords on the guitar? And it's really interesting. The more classic rock songs you study, the more you think, well, diatonically, that's bullshit. Like, why are you going to hear? I can tell you.
Yeah.
It's because it's these chords, so you can tell the lack of theory backing for a lot of those things. And I don't think anyone should lose any of that, because clearly that's part of the guitar sound, but I don't think it serves you for writing more and more interesting music and plugging in.
Yeah.
And the best way of plugging in is understanding the neck more. So like a good step to realize too is that's something that would help you a lot, because I'm sure you'd recognize them. If you're playing with this chord shape, right? This first inversion, well, you know the root's over here because you know it's a C shape, right? So if you start playing with extensions and it starts sounding weird to you, you know where that root note's got to go. One of the other notes in the chord. All right. The important thing though is to recognize what this is. And you're right. It's a A flat minor. right? With an E in the bass. And that can be kind of liberating too. The more that you can see those connections, the more kind of options you have. It's like E major 7, I might be limited, but if I think of it as E and A flat minor, then I know a whole bunch more locations on the neck where those two chords happen than any of those one chords happen.
Yeah.
And I can switch between them. So I'd say when you get some time, do the exercise again. And when chords start sounding weird, root them or put a backing track on and play those voicings over the top. Yeah, if you haven't played with extensions, there is going to be some that is just going to take some getting used to.
Yeah.
And a great place to start for that, might be going back to a blues. More on that kind of thing next week, I think, because next week we're going to take a look at a bunch of like chord progressions I think you all need to memorize and know, because they just keep coming back in pop music over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And one of them is how to get from a blues to a jazz blues, with all of the 2-5-1s and substitutes. All right, well, let's take a dive into this lesson. So this is the lesson 3, semester 2 document. All right, so here we're talking about ways of kind of getting around playing over these things, right? People often think that jazz is a very difficult style to play in. It doesn't necessarily have to be. We make it difficult because a lot of those players are really flashy, technical, great players, but really what we need to do is hit chord tones. Just need to hit what passes and think about what's important. So I think a great way for a beginner to play around with improvisation is to limit your choices. We usually teach in a certain pattern, which is learn all these scales, right, now improvise. And I think a certain amount of it is option paralysis. You teach someone a mode, and almost 9 times out of 10, right, this is what their improvisation sounds like.
Yeah.
And I think it's option paralysis. I think it's like you want to do something fast, and I don't know what else to do. I don't know how to connect that in any way. So what we're doing instead is we're applying constraints. We're going to use triad notes only and 1 or 2 extensions. Then we're going to use only the notes found on G and B. Then we're only going to really use crotchets. All right? So underneath that, we've got options for each chord. All right, E major 7, the notes go major 7, right, major 7, root, and third. For the minor 7, we get minor, third, 5, and 7. No particular rhyme or reason. These are just the ones that happen to be on these 2 strings in these locations. E7 flat 9, so we're going to go 7, root, flat 9, third. And then major 7, 6, 5, and 9, which is the 3rd, 5th, and the major 7th. Now, even just playing those, you can kind of hear these chords pass. Right? You hear the chords. Right, so if we go... all of a sudden, that's a melody that represents those chords pretty well.
Yeah.
Right? So, continuing on, underneath that, here's an example of a little melody I came up with. All right, you might actually be a little bit better if I record a quick chord loop with this. You probably could play along. So we have to wait for this to go around again, and then I'll play the melody.
Yeah.
right. So, do we agree it sounds musical?
Yes.
Okay. If we agree on that point, then we can continue the lesson. Otherwise, we need to do some revision. So, why does it sound musical? So, there are features of a melody, things that you need to think about. Sometimes things that you need to just practice. And sometimes the practice doesn't sound so musical, but it's what it acts as is something that informs your ear on how to work when you're improvising. So, step number one, melodic, they're all chord tones, with the exception of the F sharp in the A minor major 7 bar, which is the sixth of the A minor. The rest of them are all chord tones directly from the names above the chart. Voice leading. So, what do you know voice leading to be?
Making smooth transitions between chords and using contrary motion, and yeah, not really sure how to sort of put it into words, but
there's a much simpler answer.
Yeah.
This is called the leading tone, right?
Yeah.
There's only really one answer that everyone agrees on following that note.
Yeah.
And that's part of the idea, part of the reason why this melody works, right?
Yeah.
We hear that chromatic descent, right? Yeah, I ended on the major 7, which is a very tense note, so inherently there's got to be something that's going to be moving. That note is no longer going to work against a B minor chord because, what's the best way of fingering this? That kind of sound. So, predictive by announcing that, everyone in the audience goes, "Oh, I know what's going to be played next." Next note you're humming. Right.
Oh, I was going up one.
Yeah. Okay. There are sometimes there are multiple ways of resolving. But all of that is voice leading, right? It's that by using a note that creates tension, it points towards another note. And a lot of the time when a lot of people's melodies don't work when they improvise is because they play some kind of tension note and ignore it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thinking about it as chord tones actually makes that a hell of a lot easier to do. Not the ignoring, but the actual doing it successfully. Because you're always thinking of a destination. And chromatic movement around that destination is great. I think pretty much all the voice leading here is chromatic. And there is a ton of it. I've written, I don't know, 8 or 9 examples there in this 8-bar phrase. So yeah, for example, the end of the first bar, the end of the second bar. In the middle of the 5th bar in the E major 7, we get this. Right, which is a kind of voice leading in a sense because we can't go back to the original note. Right, like if it was from E major and C sharp minor, you might be, so it's another thing where we're kind of setting up the ear to predict something, and then, again in the last 2 bars, so things where we get this kind of, right, this note here, the C, is not common to an F sharp minor. It's actually an F sharp minor 7 flat 5 at that point. It's a flat 5. So including it against the F sharp minor creates a hell of a lot of tension, but it naturally resolves out to the B note, the root from the B flat 7. And that makes it feel good because we created tension and then we did something with it. We made it go away. And that's a really important lesson to learn when you're structuring or when you're practicing improvisation, is that if I create something that's got a ton of tension in it, it has to go somewhere. It has to resolve somewhere. If it doesn't resolve somewhere, it's going to sound out. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to resolve as predictably as all of this does. Like, this always resolves on the downbeat. It always resolves on, like, the first beat or on the chord change. You can do things where you preempt chords, which is, you could argue that that third last note of the piece, that could be preempting the flat 9 of the B7 flat 9. So it could be that I changed chords a bit early. So voice leading. Easiest way of thinking about that, right, on the guitar is you have a look at your chord shapes and you look at which notes are near one another. So between this E major 7 and this B minor 7 flat 5, sorry, this B minor 7, I chose to go for this one, the major 7th, to the 3rd of that chord. Equally though, you could have worked it on, right? Because this 3rd is a semitone below that 7th of the next chord.
Yeah.
So it's powerful voice leading. It really helps me. It helps us direct that melody. So first step with voice leading is you want to check out your chords. You want to see which notes are close, inside of a semitone usually, and then target those notes. Shoot for them, because they're the ones that are going to sound really cool when they change. Quite often, unless you're intentionally using some kind of pedal point line, using a note that is common between the two chords will make it feel like you didn't change.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the idea of voice leading. Always a good idea to read it in full and make sure you get all of them. Melodic mirroring. All right, so melodic mirroring is this idea that if you have the contour or shape of a melody, it should be reflected elsewhere in the piece, usually directly after it. So if we look at the notes now, we're not looking at the tab, you can see that the first two bars have a really similar shape to them. Right? They kind of have this up and then slope down, up and then slope down. And the next two bars almost have a really similar shape to them. We've got this kind of step down twice, so like a step down, leap up, step down. And we go step down, leap up, and then we step up again. All right? So that's kind of variation. It's a subtle variation on the previous bar's shape. But now it also relates to the bar after it. So the E major 7 to C sharp 7 bar, that has a really similar shape to the A minor major 7 bar. Step down, leap up.
Yeah.
It's like one step down, three steps up kind of a thing. Then the next three bars really have a very, very similar shape and kind of a very similar sound. This kind of thing is something you can practice in your soloing very intentionally. All you need to do is try to apply. You could try to apply it directly. So like we could go. So root 7, root 3rd, and we could take that down to root 7, root 3rd, root 7, root 3rd, root 7, root 3rd, root 7, root 3rd. All right. That would be a really basic form of melodic mirroring. I think that that's a good one to practice because it's really easy to understand. It's not necessarily going to yield the most musical results. You could say, instead of adapting it entirely, so you're using exactly the same positions in the triad, you could then kind of take the vibe of it, right? Still using chord tones there, but the idea is I'm seesawing backwards and forwards and leaping up. So if I went to the B minor, I could do something like this. Because melodically, right, they sound very similar and they have a very similar shape. They have the same rhythms and the kind of similar pitch directions. It doesn't have to be that verbatim. You could just copy rhythm. There are lots of songs where the thing that is shared between two lines is just the rhythm pattern.
Yeah.
Provided the rhythm pattern is distinctive enough. So having this kind of symmetry, this kind of patterning, is really important for your improv and important to practice it in and of itself. All right, so things that we could do to improve this melody. Got any ideas?
Wait, let me just. Oh. change the rhythm of it?
Yeah, that would be my first thing. Is all quarter notes. It's a great practice technique. It's a jazz player's practice technique. You remove the obligation of phrasing in many ways, and what you do instead is you focus entirely on finding the right notes. And they do this kind of thing all the time. They're doing quarters, eighths, and sometimes sixteenths too, sometimes triplets. Where the idea is you kind of practice your scales, you practice, finding your chord tones with the pressure and, I suppose, liberation of not having to worry about the timing. The timing has to be done at this completely set interval. So yeah, I would say vary the rhythm would be a great one. Extend the range a little bit. Like, it's quite a compressed little range. We go up to B and we go down to B. It's a one octave range. Now, that is pretty common for a melody. Another problem with beginner improvisers quite a lot is that they try to move too much. And if you even think of this pentatonic scale, right? That's 2.5 octaves, or 2 and a bit octaves. So already for a vocal melody, that's a huge distance.
Yeah.
And I think quite often we can get obsessed with that or that, right? No, 3.5 octaves. And it's kind of pointless in a way. Really, there's a lot you should be able to get said in 1 octave. And you should be able to follow a whole bunch of chords in 1 octave. Which is why I keep advocating for, when you practice improvisation, practice it simply. You want to look for cheesy melodies. Because all of those things are going to inform resolution. They're going to be super easy for you to hear. And if you can hear it, you can find that note on the fretboard. Even if it takes you days, right? But it wouldn't, like the more you practice this kind of thing, the more you'll realize that the note you want is probably near you. So you've only got a choice of 5 or 6 notes around there.
Yeah.
And it becomes easier and easier to direct your ear to it. And really, this is a kind of ear training. So once you get used to doing cheesy melodies, you'll find that your blues and whatever other styles you're playing are going to improve a whole lot because you'll know where to go. It won't be this kind of, I'm following my scale. And that can work a lot of the time, but it also has some times where it just does not work. And surprisingly, it can just fail to work on extremely basic chord progressions. Like one of the ones, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, if you have like a pop chord progression of... If you just use, like that's in C, if you just use C major pentatonic, some chords just don't really gel well. Like immediately this 5 chord is very hard to deal with inside of... And like that time it only worked because you heard the B. If I go... It doesn't really sound like the chords. It doesn't really reflect that too much.
Yeah.
You can do it by carefully avoiding the places which are going to cause problems, but it's just better if you follow the chords generally. Alright, so had a look at how all of this stuff is done. Right, underneath here we've got this idea of using scales to do this. And one of the problems with using scales, like we just discussed, is that they're going to contain a lot of notes. And if you're not thinking about chord tones while you're doing it, it will sound ungrounded. It'll just sound like a bunch of notes. Like, it is true that when I'm improvising, I never lose blocks of scales underneath my fingers while I'm playing. But more and more, I'm trying to use them less as the primary route. I feel like in many ways we're taught these things wrong. And I did it to you all again. We focused on learning arpeggios and scales last term.
Yeah.
That was more just so that you guys had them under your fingers because you will need them. And especially the flashier you want to be. Like, you want to include a run that goes from here to here. It's really hard to do that with arpeggios, but if you practice your scales, it's super easy.
Yeah.
But the scale in and of themselves isn't necessarily an answer. It's not going to make you immediately sound in sync with the chords or in sync with the music. You've got to be selective about them. And then treat all of these other ones as options, passing tones, things that you could use to connect ID 1 to ID 2.
Yeah.
So underneath that, we've got a list of, say, just some basic chord shapes with some scales you could use to represent those chord shapes. So definitely worth taking a look at and playing through. There are some interesting problems with this method, like if we look at the bar E, where it goes to C sharp 7, right? So it's the fifth bar. What's weird about that? Like I've said that now about 3 times, that that's a weird choice inside of the key.
There's a lot of sort of chromatics within. If you're are you talking about using
just the 2 chords, like E major and C sharp major? What's wrong with that?
There's a lot of sort of clashes between like notes within the chords. Like you'd have obviously the F on top of the E.
Yeah.
And you'd also have
so
I think G sharp on the. Oh wait, no, G sharp.
This is a common thing to do, by the way. What we've done is we've taken the 6th chord and made it major, or actually what we've done is taken the 6th chord and make it dominant. Happens a lot all the time in blues. You would have seen it a million times by now, and in like a lot of pop songs. The reason they do that, right, is that the chord progression usually goes 1, 6, 2. I mean, 4 and 2 are essentially the same chord, but 2, 5. And the problem with the 1 to 6 change, not a great deal of change, really. It's just like a bass note movement.
Yeah.
When I was doing Amy B theory, way back when, that was one of the movements where you weren't allowed to use it. You know, you can't go 1 to 6. That's just there's no change. There's no point.
Yeah.
It used to like grind my gears quite a lot because I'm like, have you heard Blue Moon? Have you heard like half of the jazz standards? They all use this. Have you heard half of pop music? However, it is interesting in a lot of pop songs that they break it up with the 5 in between. You know, so it's like we go 1 chord, then 5, and then the 6. So that way the 6 actually sounds more interesting and more distinct. But what we do instead is treat the 6 as a secondary dominant, right? So like up to this C sharp, it's going to a D minor. Well, that's a 5-1 change. Anytime we go E shape to A shape, that's a 5-1. So in order to make the 2 chord feel bolder and more significant, if you make that a dominant 7, that resolve feels nicer because we get that, the 5-1 cadence.
Yeah.
But if we're thinking about that purely in scale language, you either have to switch scales in between, or you've got to think of dropping a note and adding a note inside of a scale block. And I don't find that very convenient as a player. It's essentially what you end up doing, except if you think about it from an arpeggio perspective or a chords perspective, you're like, well, here's E. And right, there's your C sharp 7. If I think that on top of that, I can use my pentatonic scale. Right? Overlaying those 2 things, much easier. I know that I'm not allowed to hit this note on the, well, I mean, I am allowed. Yeah, we could do that kind of thing. It's also the sharp 9. And if we're going for a dominant sound, then sharp 9's not too bad, you know. That results okay. It's not really a big deal. So I think that by thinking about them in chord tones, the accidentals happen more easily. Especially as songs break the key more and more and more. If you're thinking in arpeggios, those accidentals are taken care of, and all you need to do is think about options around those notes.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so let's give it a go. So what I'd like you to do is take, say, the first 5 changes and come up with melody.
Okay.
Right?
Using the scales of each of those, or just like using.
Look, you can do it however you want. The end goal is to have a melody that when it's heard, people go, oh, I know what these chords are.
Yeah.
So I would say still only use the G and B strings. This is an interesting practice technique that I think everyone should start using a little bit more, which is just, it's a great way of pushing yourself out of your old ideas because they won't work.
Oh, yeah. I'll figure something out.
Yeah. Give yourself a couple of minutes. You know, you can mute yourself if you're self-conscious about it.
Oh.
Only 2 strings too.
Oh, no.
You're only doing the first 4 bars, yeah?
Yeah.
You seem like you've almost got a theme for the first chord. Have you got that?
Yeah, sort of.
Yep. Okay, so let's do a little bit of quick melodic analysis on that line particularly. All right. In terms of basic or advanced melody, that's a very advanced melody. Why would I say that? Well, we start on the 6 on the downbeat. So here's the root we're supposed to be reading this against. Right? So the melody really hits as emphasizing notes, the 6 and the 9 on this major chord.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a problem, but for you as a developing musician, it's a little bit of a problem. Because I think when you hear that, I don't think you hear this chord. I don't think you hear major 7. Right? Because you're hearing that 9 emphasized so much. Right? Now, if you were going to use that chord, you could change the chord underneath it to be a ninth. That sounds closer, but you can hear how complex the chord sound is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's because you're choosing complex notes to do it. Now, the melody shape itself is cool. I really like that, and I think you could continue to play with that. It's just very advanced sounding.
Yeah.
And I think a better place to start would be worry more about, say, 1, 3, and 5. Like worry. Think about that. That's. All right. And like we can make a melody just with those and hitting the changing tones, like. Right? Like,
yeah.
That's a super basic melody, just using chord tones. So if you start closer to that kind of thing and think about your extensions as the notes you put in between them, I think you'll go a little bit easier with it. Not that I think that melody was necessarily bad. Like, I actually think that's a cool sweeping melody. Yeah, that has some cool classical kind of melodic shape to it, which I really, really quite like. But I think it's going to be hard for you to work with. So boil it down a bit. Play your root notes first and think about those. And then apply some of those other scale notes on top of it.
Yeah. Because the other thing, I find it hard to like identify notes as I'm playing. That's like the one thing I like really struggle with. Like,
you mean with the letters that you're identifying, or with
because like I sort of have to use octave intervals because obviously like top 2 strings are the the things I know best, and then but because I've tried to practice like identifying, but I just can't sort of memorize them. Like
you can, and you can, and you will. It just takes time.
Yeah.
Like the hardest thing about this course for all you guys is that a lot of the other musicians who are doing other instruments have done this shit for years, and guitarists can get up to a certain level of skill that seems performatively comparable to all of that, and then are shocked by, oh shit, that all of this stuff. Oh man, oh man, now I got to learn scales. Now I got to learn this. And it's like it seems really overwhelming. And realistically, like guitar should be taught better. People should be introduced to these concepts a lot earlier. Ideally, at a university level, I would have wanted you to start tackling this stuff, thoughts like this in year 9 or year 10. So that way you have a couple of years to get them under your fingers. And then university is about how to expand on those and use them in more creative ways. So there is definitely a crash course vibe. And especially with my course, like I get you guys for 10 lessons and 2 exams. And what I've tried to do with that amount of space is everything that I think you might need to know in order to understand the rest of your uni course, to at least give you the nuts and bolts of it. Which means that I don't expect you to perfect any of this stuff. I expect that this is all stuff that you continue to think about for the next, say, 10 years. And expand upon. So, what I would suggest you do, you played the triads of this really easily. Right, you play those triads? A, B minor, E7, A minor.
So E, is it E, B? Are you going between, okay, so E.
So E, B minor, E7. The 7 is important here.
Wait.
Just missed the E7, yeah? You just want an E7 in there, in between.
That's why. Because I was reading like the chords of the bottom part. I'll just scroll up to the. Okay.
Yeah. Don't worry about the flat 9s. If you see anything past the 7, you just plain out ignore it. So E major, B minor, E7. So, well, go back to this E shape, right? This one here.
Yeah.
Take the root and flatten it by a tone.
Oh wait.
By tone. Yeah, it's this A7 bar chord shape. major, then A minor. Okay, play that a couple times, and then they are the melody notes you start with.
Yeah.
All right, so now that you've done that, add a bit of rhythm. So at the moment you're going ba 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 do
Yeah.
ba do ba do. So just put any kind of rhythm on top of it.
Yeah.
Okay, can you see anywhere where the two triads have got a voice that's a semitone apart?
Oh, I know. Oh, the major and minor.
Major, minor, and also check out where it goes from E7 to
Ah.
A major, right? The seventh falls to the third.
Yeah.
Okay, these are now your target tones. All right, so we want to target each of those. They have to happen in your melody now. That's just a new rule to live with for a second. So we play the. Right? So we're hitting those ones now. We're aiming for them. And that's going to give your melody even a little bit more of direction.
Oh.
Didn't that sound nice? Now, you do want to play the flat 7 just before you play the third of the A. Da da, so we get that fall. Ah, that's starting to sound cooler, right?
I know. Oh, that wasn't.
All right. So that's starting to sound a step better. Now we are still talking basic sounds here, so we're still not up to the stage of it sounding, symphonic or whatever.
Yeah.
But you can see how that's starting to give you a bit of direction in how to approach it. The next thing is, if you think about a couple of these things with their extensions, a lot more notes become a lot closer to one another. So here's E, and here's E major 7. So we include that note. And then we go to B minor, and to B minor 7. So they're the ones that we're going to add in. So E major 7 and B minor 7, which could be either of these. It's, depending on where you put the 7.
Yeah.
So now we could start. That chromatic line down to here sounds really cool.
Yeah.
That's the 7 on the B minor coming down to the third from the E7. Now we've got, in that first two steps, we've got some chromatic moves as well. All right, so try that now. So what we're going to do is E major, the major 7th changing down to the B minor. The B minor changes from here to here on the E7. Because that's the semitone apart. See if you can work those in. Ooh, then we'll have to work that.
Oh. Oh. I found it a bit weird going from the B minor 7 to the E7.
Yeah, part of it
There's
is
very similar notes.
Yeah, part of it is that you're taking a lot of extra time with it.
Yeah.
That's something I advise people to do is like, don't worry about the rhythm so much, just try to get the melody connect. But because of that, you sit so long on it. So if we're going B minor.
Yeah.
Right. That's one way of getting between the two of them, right? I come up this B minor arpeggio. And you can see there, I use the 7 as an announcement of where this one's going. It's what we call an encapsulation. It's rounding tones. Yeah. So. So you come down your E arpeggio. E down, flat 7, 5, 38. So what I did there was a lot of curious. I used encapsulation on both. So I start on the B minor. I play the 2 notes in the B minor around the 3rd that I'm going to. Then I come down an E7 arpeggio. But these 2 notes are an encapsulation of this note. They're the 2 notes around that one. Which is why melodically it was announced, right? It's a pattern and they're surrounding tones.
Yeah.
We have to wrap it up there. If you want to have a chat more about it during the week, let me know. I'm happy to meet up and have a chat. That's where I think you should start, right? Start with your primary triads, just the basic shapes. Try to construct melodies out of them, and then use any of your extensions or your scales to give you extra choices on how to make this melody sound less bland.
Yeah.
Look for anything that leans on one another, a semitone apart. That's a really great point to hit on, because it's going to create an announcement. I'm going to this note, and that's what makes things sound really cohesive. It makes it sound like it's a written melody rather than someone's improvisation.
Yeah.
I also wouldn't throw out that first melody you had. You probably got a bunch of cool stuff that can come out.
I think it makes a lot more sense going, because I think the more basic it is, obviously it's easier and it sounds a lot better because it's hitting the right sort of
Half
note.
of it is just training yourself to be able to hear this stuff, right?
Like,
the reason I hit on this method, man, I do have to be quick, so I'm 5 minutes left from my class. The reason I hit on this method was because I learned jazz licks for years. I learned whole songs by Django Reinhardt. I knew a bunch of vocabulary, but I could never make it into my playing. And the difference is that licks are really only good in certain instances. And I never heard those licks. That wasn't what I heard when I came to this point. I'm not this person, so I didn't hear his lick. What I figured out I needed to do is create these kind of sounds. And how do you do that? Well, you focus in on how to match those chords. That's what any melody does, right? There's 2 ways of writing a song. You write the melody first, then the chords around it, or the chords first and the melody around it, and both of them end up being essentially the same path. Yeah. This whole division between melody and chords that we have didn't exist, go back 50, 100 years. And the more advanced a musician is, the less they think about it as being 2 separate things. Harmony is just a melody line that supports a melody. Yeah. All righty, mate. So, more than happy to meet up, play around with it for a bit. If you want to meet up for have a half-hour chat and work on it a bit more, let me know.
Yep. Will do.
Awesome, man.
Thank you.
Catch you in the next one.
Yeah. See ya.
See you, mate.